In this video, we are going to explore what are scriptable objects and how we can use them in our tank game. For example, we are going to implement scriptable objects to decide what is the shooting pattern of our tank. Our tank has a script called turret that is responsible for the shooting mechanic, and it is driven by the basic turret data, which is a scriptable object. And it has the prefab for the bullet, the scriptable object for the bullet data and the reload delay, so that now we can simply swap this object for our tank turret to the fast turret data. So now our tank will shoot much faster and the bullets will fly much quicker. So the idea is that we are going to split the behavior of our tank from the data, and the data will be stored in a separate object. Okay, let's get going. This video is part of the series of videos about creating a 2D top-down tank game. We will explore different features of this game, each as a standalone video. Hi, I'm Peter and welcome to Sunny Valley Studio Tutorials. In this video we are going to discuss scriptable objects and implement them into our game. So let's take a look at the documentation for the scriptable object. A scriptable object is a data container that you can use to save large amounts of data independently from the class instances that we are using. So this makes them very useful because we can populate them with parameters and pass them to our class instances, for example to our tanks, and we can set here the movement speed in our scriptable object and create it through the inspector. Now, why would this be useful or more useful than keeping those parameters in a simple mono behavior like we have right now? Let's go to our project. In our game, we have our player, which has a tank game object in it, and the tank game object is just simply the tank, and the player has the player input on it that we are passing to a tank object. And the tank object has in it the tank base, which has tank mover, and the tank mover basically is responsible for moving our tank. So let's press play. And let's say that we do not like how slow our tank is moving, so we want to change the max speed to 120, for example. Let's see. Okay, our tank is moving much more quickly. Okay, great, let's stop it. The value here in the inspector went back to the 70, and this is because when we exit the play mode, it goes back, so we need to set it here. Okay, and now we're good to go. Okay, but let's say that we have some kind of an upgrade lying around when we kill an enemy, and this update should increase our speed. So instead of changing this value, we would simply swap our data for a scriptable object. So let's create our scriptable object and let's see how much more beneficial it is to keep the data in a separate object rather than in the script itself. So to create a scriptable object, let's go to our scripts folder. Let's create a new folder. Let's call it data so. All we need to do is right click and create a new C# script. Let's call it tank movement data. Okay, let's open this script up in Visual Studio. Okay, and what we want to do is we want to delete the start and update, and instead of inheriting from mono behavior, we want to inherit from scriptable object. Okay, and that's basically it. So now we can create here parameters for our tank movement script. Okay, we had max speed, rotation speed, acceleration and deceleration saved in our tank movement script, so now we are going to save it in our scriptable object. But we need a way to create a scriptable object from our inspector. So what we are going to do is we are going to add an attribute above our class name. We're going to open the square brackets and add create asset menu and open parentheses, and you can see that this will allow us to make a scriptable object derived type to be automatically listed in the asset create sub menu in Unity so that we can easily create it in our inspector. So now we can pass here file name, menu name and order. So file name will be the name of the file that is created. So let's type file name equals, and let's call it new tank movement data. Let's add comma. Let's type menu name. And now in quotation marks, you are going to type the name that will appear in our create menu in Unity inspector. So we are going to create data slash, and we are going to say that we want it to be, for example, tank movement data. Let's save it. And now if we go back to Unity, in the project section we are going to be able to right click, create, and we should see the data at the top of it, and we should see the tank movement data. And now we have created a scriptable object instance saved as .asset file. I will want to delete this one, and I will want to create a new folder here. Let's call it data. And here I will create a new folder, tank movement, or maybe tank data. And here I will simply create a new data, tank movement data, and let's say player movement or player tank movement data. Okay, so now let's see how are the settings for our tank base. In our tank mover we have 100, I think it was 70 previously, 70, 200, 70 and 50. So let's set it in our scriptable object. Okay, so now how do we use this scriptable object in our script? So let's go to our tank base and let's open our tank mover script. Great. So instead of passing those parameters here, basically those and the speed and max rotation, we're going to create a new public field. So let's create public tank movement data, and let's call it tank or movement data. Okay, and now what we can do is pass it through the inspector, and when we are using the acceleration we are going to say tank movement data dot acceleration, tank movement data dot deacceleration, tank movement data dot max speed, and tank movement data dot rotation speed. So now let's save it. Let's go back to Unity. Okay, so now let's select our tank base for our player, and let's drag our player movement data to our tank mover. But now our enemy that we have as a placeholder here also requires the tank movement data instead of the parameters. So what we can do is simply duplicate our scriptable object using Ctrl D, and let's call it enemy tank movement data. Okay, and let's set the max speed to be, for example, 50, and rotation speed to be 150. Right now we are not going to see the difference, but basically we will need to provide it for our enemy tank as well. And now if we press play, basically the game will run the same as it had previously. But now we have one advantage. So let's say that we want to have an upgrade. After we kill the enemy, there should appear a coin, for example, and if we drive into it, we will get a boost to speed. So what we can do is simply duplicate the scriptable object, and let's call it player or maybe boost tank movement speed, and let's set the max speed to be 150 to see the difference. Now what we can do is simply swap for our tank base the movement data to the boost tank movement, and now if we are going to run the game, we're going to see that our tank moves much faster. And what is also great about the scriptable objects is that if we swap this for the player tank movement data and we want to set the movement to be a bit faster, so let's say that we want to test 120, and now we are going to test our tank movement, and we say okay, this is the default value that we want. We're going to stop the game, and the value is still saved in our scriptable object. Now second place when it would be useful to use scriptable object would be for our prefabs for our bullet, since as you can see the bullet script is using the speed, the damage and the max distance. So again here we would use the scriptable object as well to use to set those settings. So let me show you one that I have created for the bullet. Okay, here it is. This is bullet data. It inherits a scriptable object, has a create asset menu that creates a menu name in the same data folder slash, and here is the bullet data, and has speed, damage and max distance. And let's see the bullet script now. Okay, here you can see the bullet data reference, and we are going to set the bullet data through the initialize method so that our turret will now decide what type of bullet we want to have. And this will be very useful when we want to create multiple turrets that are a bit different with different behaviors. So let me show you the scriptable object for the turret that I have created. Okay, and as you can see now our turret data will contain the reference to our game object, the reload delay and the bullet data, so that we are going to control basically everything. And again, this is deriving from scriptable object and it has the create asset menu. So now with this system in place, we can create multiple setups for our turret and multiple setups for our bullet data, and we can create basically the different turrets for our different tanks and maybe create upgrades for our tanks, turrets. So let's see how it would look like in our project. Now, just before we go, let me show you the turret script. Now, turret script contains the turret data field. And now we are using this turret data for the initialization of our bullet pool. We are passing the turret data.bullet prefab. Next, in the shoot method, we are using the turret data.reload delay to decide what is the delay of our shooting mechanic. And when we are calling the for each loop for each barrel of our turret, we are initializing the bullet using the turret data.bullet data so that we can control how fast our bullet will fly from our turret. So let's save it. Let's go back to Unity Inspector. Okay, so here in our data folder, now we have, beside the tank data, we have bullet data, which contains the fast bullet, which has a speed of 10, and slow bullet, which has speed of 5. We could create more bullets here, as well as we have tank turret data, and we have turret data basic, which is simple bullet prefab, reload delay is 1, and bullet data is slow bullet, and also fast turret, which has reload speed of 0.3, the same bullet prefab, and we have slow bullet data. We can swap it, for example, to fast bullet data. And of course, we need to set the turret data to our tank. So the easiest way is to open the prefab. If we have a prefab, select the tank turret and set the turret data to be, for example, to basic turret data. So now if we press play, we can see that our tank is shooting the same way as it did. But now we can create, for example, upgrades for our tank, and we can select our tank and swap the turret data, for example, for the fast turret data. And now our tank is shooting much faster, and we can implement different ways to improve our tank game and introduce additional mechanics for our tank. Now this will be useful for our tank enemies when we are going to create the AI section for it, so that we can set the tank turret for our enemies to be the basic turret or slow turret, so it will shoot much slower, the bullets will be much slower, and we control all of it using the tank turret data because it contains the bullet prefab, the reload delay, as well as the bullet data that we want to pass to our bullets. So basically we have one prefab of a bullet that we can reuse and set this to different settings from the level of our tank turret. I hope this explains a bit how you can use your scriptable objects to improve the way you have created your game to make it more modular. Since our enemy is immovable right now, I think it would be a good idea in the next video to try to tackle the simple AI for our enemy, so that's what we're going to tackle on in the next video. If you want to support me, please take a look at my Patreon website, check out my Udemy course about creating a 2D top-down shooter using the URP and Unity 2020. There will be a link with a discount in the description if you are interested. Okay, great, thank you for watching. Leave a like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next video. Take care.